Flowers have forever been one of the earth's greatest natural beauties, which we all enjoy, from the earliest moments of childhood right through every imaginable celebration to our final place of rest. From a field of poppies to just a single dandelion growing through a crack in the pavement, flowers help to brighten our surroundings and improve our quality of life in the simplest of ways. Flowers can be found growing almost anywhere, and it's actually really hard to find a place where wildflowers don't grow. But one of the greatest joys of the flowers of Britain is the fact that you don't need to be a professional botanist or even a great scientist to appreciate them. And as you are about to see, you don't need to be a gardening expert either to grow your very own collection of beautiful flowers in your own backyard. There are over 270,000 flowering plants in the world, and just over 1,500 of them are indigenous to Great Britain. As there are so many species, not all of which are considered lovely by any means, people can tend to view certain of Britain's native flowers as weeds, especially as they spread themselves so quickly, giving more formal gardeners a great deal of work to get rid of them. Also, gardens nowadays can be filled with exotic, brightly coloured blooms from all over the world, and a native British plant trying to compete with these imported flowers can pale into insignificance. Nevertheless, these wild flowers are only doing what comes naturally, and in other words, are not weeds at all, but simply plants in the wrong place at the wrong time, which is really the only fundamental difference between a weed and a flower. The majority of familiar plants have usually been purposely grown in a cultivated area, while a weed is a plant that is growing in a place where it should not be. You could have the most stunning rose ever seen, but if it was growing in a field where the owner had wanted to produce nothing but thistles and brambles, the rose would be considered a weed. Now, useful as this might be in establishing the difference between a plant and a weed, we still need to pose the question, what exactly is a flower? Considering how much pleasure we all get from beautiful blooms like the ones you see before you, it would be easy to assume that they are nature's gift to humanity. Yet flowers have a much more important role to fulfill as part of a plant's life cycle, attracting insects so the plant can reproduce, providing a constant source of food and nourishment to our entire ecosystem. Just as we may put on our favourite clothing and perfume to help attract someone special, the plant will produce brightly coloured petals and aromas in the hope that a passing bee or bug might stop by and pollinate it. Of course, there are also many wind-pollinated plants, although the flowers on these are far simpler as they don't have to impress the local wildlife. Most plants will flower every year so they can produce new seeds, and the way they do this is through pollination. Pollination is a fascinating process that you can actually see happening if you spend enough time looking at any given collection of growing flowers. In the most basic terms, an insect will be attracted to a flower by its colour and smell, and will land on the petals and feed on the flower's nectar. While this is happening, the insect or bug will pick up pollen on its body from the male part of the flower, which is called the stamen. The insect then flies onto the next flower in search of more nectar, and the pollen from the previous plant will rub off onto the female part of the flower called the style. If this whole process is successfully executed, then the plant can carry on growing by producing seeds for the following year, and we can enjoy the blooms all over again, which is why plants can live on from generation to generation. Although wildflowers grow throughout the British landscape, more and more people are choosing to cultivate these native blooms in their own gardens, and there are a number of reasons why this practice is becoming increasingly popular. Wildflowers help to produce water-wise gardens, which means that because the plants are local to the area, they can thrive in the rainfall and weather conditions native to the region. Neighbouring wildlife can also utilise the plants, although you might want to discourage snails and slugs, while creatures like ladybirds will actually benefit your garden, keeping many of the well-known pests under control. In fact, wildflowers can be left pretty much to their own devices, but there is just one word of warning, as they can very quickly take over an entire garden, so they still need to be cultivated in an urban environment. Gardens have long been a great way to introduce colour and wildlife into your home environment, and whether you have acres of land or a tiny window box, you can create yourself a haven for great British flowers right on your own doorstep. However, before we find out more about the best-loved species native to the United Kingdom, it's well worth looking into how our passion for flowers in our gardens actually developed down through the ages. The first ever gardens can be traced back to about 10,000 years ago in Western Asia. While the rest of the world were using the hunting and gathering method to find food, the people of Asia decided to grow wild grasses to eat, as they thought it a more assured means of survival. Over time, they became very selective in choosing high-yield crops until they were extremely proficient farmers, a vital part of food production to this very day. The technique of cultivating crops came to Britain very soon after this. However, gardens, as we would understand them, took a little more time. They weren't actually introduced here until the Romans invaded in AD 43, and just like their straight roads, education, central heating and sanitation, we have the Romans to thank for our great British institution, the garden. The gardens of Roman times were very formal to look at, with neat paths and well-kept hedges, not unlike those you will find at the stately homes you might visit today. They remained like this for almost 2,000 years, and it wasn't until the 1870s when the writer William Robinson and the prolific gardener Gertrude Jekyll came up with the brilliant idea of developing cultivated but wild gardens. What they aspired to was spaces that looked untamed and natural, to have gardens that contrasted with everything the Victorian estates of the time stood for. This championed the ever-popular English cottage and wild garden style that countless people still choose to use today. The wild garden has boomed over the last few years, becoming increasingly popular with both the extremely busy and the conscientious organic gardeners amongst us, and they really do produce wonderful flowers throughout the whole year. But flowers are not only a major part of our ecostructure and our leisure time, they also play an important part in our social history as well. Remembrance Sunday is one of the most significant events linked with a wildflower, as the poppy is used as the symbol for this occasion. The trench warfare of World War I on the bloody battlefields of Flanders and the Somme claimed the lives of many young men and also completely decimated the once beautiful rural landscapes of northern France and Belgium. After the war, the fields were desolate and deserted, and nothing would grow there. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, poppies began to spring up all over the battlefields, and even to this day the poppies remain. This is a shining example of how wildflowers will grow and thrive in almost any environment. So when we wear our poppies with pride, we remember not only the atrocities of war, but also the soldiers who bravely made the ultimate sacrifice in order for future generations to live in a safer world free of tyranny. Yet poppies are far from being the only flower we use to symbolise emotions and thoughts, because for centuries flowers have been used to represent words and ideas. Friends and lovers still to this day tend to give each other bouquets, and when those we care for die, we send floral tributes to express our sympathy. Such traditions have evolved from 17th century Constantinople, which is better known in the modern world as Istanbul. Lovers who didn't want to draw attention to themselves could send messages to one another using flowers to communicate their feelings without raising any suspicions. Known as the language of flowers, this practice was introduced to Europe by Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, a society lady of the day who in 1716 sent a love letter from Turkey to England that spoke of the language of flowers. Over 800 flowers have special words or meanings, and roses alone have a colossal 30 different translations. For example, a pink rose means perfect happiness and please believe me. A red rosebud means pure and lovely, while a black rose is used to symbolise death. The notion of using flowers to send messages was first taken to heart by the French, and eventually, during the reign of Queen Victoria, it became equally popular throughout Great Britain. But many of the flowers we are going to look at now rarely crop up in formal bouquets, although you'll find them nationwide almost wherever you look. The daisy is one of the quintessential native flowers of Great Britain and one that is often overlooked. Gardeners for generations have tried to remove this dainty little flower from their lawns, as the daisy has an uncanny knack of always being able to pop up in the most refined of cultivated green spaces. Their instantly recognisable white petals with a yellow centre were once a common sight over lawns all across the country, but with all kinds of weed killers available to dispose of them, they tended to be removed. It's only more recently that gardeners have been trying to reintroduce the daisy to their grass for a more natural look, much to the delight of any beekeepers in the neighbourhood. The daisy normally grows to about 6 centimetres in height, with small blooms that are just over a centimetre in diameter. Daisies will flower for much of the year, so even during the colder months you can have a little interest in the garden. There are also taller, larger varieties that look great in meadow areas of the garden or in borders. Daisies are extremely easy to look after. Once they have germinated, they will seed themselves and can survive just about anything, including severe drought and cold. Here's another easily recognisable flower, the pansy. The wild pansy has been a gardener's favourite for many years, and although most gardens are home to the now cultivated pansy, all of them derive from the European wild species. Wild pansies have a striking bloom that consists of 5 petals, and there are many varying colours, yet all have the eyelash-style markings that spread from the centre of the flower. The wild pansy can be found on grassland and uncultivated areas nationwide. Wild pansy folklore is a fascinating example of why people should avoid picking wild flowers from their natural habitat. Legend states that if you pick a pansy with dew on it, a loved one will die. The wild pansy is actually edible, and it can be eaten raw or cooked. People for many years have used the leaves to thicken soups or make tea out of, and as even the petals can be eaten, they make an interesting garnish or add great colour to a salad that will be bound to impress your dinner guests. If you want to grow pansies, it's just as easy to find a cultivated variety in your local garden centre, where you'll be able to buy a species that suits your particular soil type, as there are over 400 types of pansy, so finding a plant that will thrive in your garden couldn't be easier. One of Great Britain's most aromatic native flowers is the common sea lavender that turns entire fields into a wonderful purple haze during July and August, when the heady smell is frequently associated with the height of summer. The lavender normally forms bushes of grey-green foliage with masses of tiny purple flowers which smell absolutely divine. If you want to introduce gardening to young children, then lavender is a great plant to start them off with. The lavender is an extremely hassle-free plant to grow, as little hands can easily get to grips with planting it out, and if they forget to water the lavender for a few days, there's no need to worry, because this kind of hardy plant will be fine. Just remember to give it a sunny spot with well-draining soil, and this amazing flower will flourish for many years. Our friends the Romans were once again responsible for introducing the many uses of lavender to Great Britain. They would use the purple flower in their magnificent Roman baths as an early form of bath oil, as well as utilising the plant for medical purposes. It was believed that lavender could cure throat infections and chest complaints, and many natural herbalists will still use the lavender in much the same way, even in the 21st century. The poppy, as we've already seen, is a flower with a social conscience, as well as being very attractive indeed. The species used for Remembrance Day is the corn poppy, and its red petals and black centre are the most distinctive features of this plant. Poppies have 4 to 6 petals of varying colour, and in the centre they always have a spiral of stamens that are a different colour to the petals. The foliage is a light grey-green with deep toothing all the way around. Poppies are very common in Great Britain and can be often seen growing at roadsides along motorways. They can survive in extremely arid conditions and are great for the gardener who doesn't get the chance to water every day. When the petals die, a large spherical seed pod is left on the end of the stalk. If you shake this, you can hear the seeds rattling inside. The seed pod is designed to be a little like a pepper shaker, so when it sways in the wind, the seed pod can evenly release the seeds through the holes around it. Poppy seeds taste great on bread and in cakes, and the drug opium is also made from unripe seed pods of certain of the species. Many childhood memories are littered with the lovely buttercup, as this little flower is often used by children to find out who likes butter and who doesn't, by seeing if a yellow shadow is cast under the chin when the buttercup is placed just below it. This flower dominates British meadows in spring and early summer, which is great for passers-by, although for farmers it can be a real problem, as the buttercup can be poisonous to cattle if they eat too many. Identification is very straightforward, as there are 5 extremely glossy petals, and the name comes from the fact that they shine just like butter in the sun. Another name that this flower is known by is crow's feet, which is pretty self-explanatory because the leaves of the plant look very much like a crow's foot. Fortunately, just like the daisy, buttercups are very easy to introduce and grow on lawns. Not only do they add a wonderful rich yellow colour, they also attract ladybirds and bees to your garden in the summer, which is very good news indeed. The primrose and its close relative, the cowslip, are another common sight in fields and verges throughout Great Britain. There are over 400 species of primrose worldwide, and they're so popular, many cultivated variants can be bought in garden centres and nurseries. The leaves of both the cowslip and primrose are crinkled and dark green in colour, and they're a good-sized elongated diamond shape. The blooms vary in colour, with the most common being yellow with orangey red stamens. The flowers of the cowslip flop and fuse into a short tube and face downwards, while the primrose flowers reach up to the sun. The primrose is one of the first species to bloom in the spring and is a great indication that warmer days are on their way. The race to be the first plant to appear at the beginning of the year is normally won by this beautiful little flower, the snowdrop. This plant will be forcing its way through the ground during December and will flower in early January. Although the snowdrop isn't technically native to Great Britain as it was first brought over from Italy, it has colonised many woodland shady paths all over the country and is now a familiar treasure of the British countryside. The snowdrop is a very thin plant with leaves described as being strap-like of a dark blue-green colour. The blooms are extremely delicate and, as the name would suggest, resemble lightly falling snow. There is only one flower per stem and the white flowers have a slight green marking towards the centre. This is a great plant for your borders around the garden to add some cheer in the depths of winter. It's also nice to plant some of the bulbs on your lawn, as they add a real visual point of interest when you look out on a wintry garden. As an interesting aside, experiments are currently being carried out on this small flower, as it seems to have healing properties that can help sufferers of Alzheimer's disease, and although it's not seen as a potential cure, it can ease some of the effects. There is nothing lovelier than a British wood covered in a carpet of bluebells, and to many this plant is viewed as our national flower. During April and May, the country's woodlands are not only coming alive with green, but also exploding with the purple and blue of these flowers. In Britain we are fortunate, as bluebells still grow in abundance, and enthusiastic plant lovers travel from all over the world to enjoy the spring woodlands when the bluebells are in bloom. Although a single bluebell flower is similar in size to the snowdrop, there are many flowers on each stem. The flowers point up when they are in bud, yet when they open they droop towards the ground, so they look like miniature bells hanging from the plant, hence their name. The leaves are very slim and can grow up to 45 centimetres in length, helping to create a carpet of green over the forest floor. Bluebells are very easy to grow, and once the bulbs are planted, they should flower each spring for many years. But get your plants from a garden centre and leave the ones in the wild undisturbed for everyone to enjoy. Another favourite springtime flower is the daffodil, and there are many cultivated variants now, but they all come from the original wild daffodil that is still in abundance along shady paths and in woodlands throughout Great Britain. The wild daffodil is smaller than its cultivated cousin, although the blooms have just as much impact and colour. There is one bloom on each stem, and the flower is formed of a tube in the middle with coloured petals around the outside of it. The leaves are slender and green and create thick foliage to surround the plant. The scientific name for the daffodil is Narcissus, which is taken from the Greek god who fell in love with his own reflection, and when you see a mass of these flowers, you can see why it has been called this. These are wonderful plants to grow with children because they are so easy to maintain and produce large, rich yellow flowers that young ones love. Just remember to deadhead the flowers after they fade and leave the foliage on the plant for at least 6 weeks before cutting back, as this ensures that all the nutrients return to the bulb to help it flower the following year. The daffodil has become a Welsh national emblem over time, an honour it shares with the tasty but much less attractive to look at leek. Our next flower, the dandelion, it has to be said, is viewed by most people as a weed, yet in reality it's just brilliant at seeding and spreading itself far and wide across the countryside. The dandelion is an extremely deep-rooting plant that is notoriously difficult to kill, with many gardeners thinking they've succeeded, only to find a few days later the persistent plant growing back from the dead. Although this plant is seen as a pest, in meadow gardens it can add lovely colour, and as it flowers for much of the year, it will help to keep your wild garden looking great. The blooms are formed of many tightly packed yellow petals that are perched on the end of a hollow stem. The leaves are long and jaggedly toothed and are said to resemble lion's teeth, hence the flower's name. They are a great favourite with pet rabbits, but wash your hands after you've picked them, because this is one plant that smells absolutely horrible. There are many superstitions linked to wildflowers, and moving on to look at clover will certainly find that this flower has more than its fair share. Clover is a small broadleaf plant that's often found growing on lawns. It's exceptionally widespread, and chances are that it's already in your back garden. The blooms are extremely small and are made up of miniature tubular flowers in a spherical formation that vary in colour from white through to pink and red. One of clover's most recognisable features will be the 3 leaves that form a triangular shape on the plant's stem. Of course, any lucky ones amongst us may have seen a 4-leafed clover variety, although the chances of this happening have been worked out somewhere in the region of 10,000 to 1. This tradition comes from the Middle Ages, when it was thought that if you found a 4-leafed clover, then you'd also be able to find fairies. Even early Christians used the clover as a sign of luck, saying that Eve took one with her from the Garden of Eden, so anyone who carried a clover stem with them was said to have a piece of paradise. The orchid is a flower that tops many lists of favourite plants. They are exotic-looking flowers that are sadly getting very rare in the wild, so you really have to be lucky, perhaps you need to find a 4-leafed clover first, to spot one of these plants in the countryside. There are over 20,000 different types of orchid, with Britain being home to around 50 wild species. Most are very limited as to where they can grow, and due to this fact they are notoriously difficult to look after. You'll struggle to find many native orchids at a garden centre, but you will, however, see a vast range of cultivated varieties, and they can look very similar to the wild species and really do stand out in a garden or as an indoor houseplant. However, orchids are not for the novice, although if you do the research and look after the plants well, they will reward you with some of the most astonishing blooms you are ever likely to see. Moving on, some would say from the sublime to the ridiculous, we come to one of the most underrated and underused of Great Britain's native flowers. The leaves of the dead nettle look just like that of the common stinging nettle, with serrations all around the dark green leaf, although thankfully it lacks the stinging hairs, which is why it's called the dead nettle. The dead nettle flowers from May all the way through till December, and it produces clusters of pretty blooms that circle the stalks of the plant. It will thrive in almost any conditions and can grow in any soil type, in sunshine or in shade, requiring only to be kept damp. Not only can you find this plant growing in woodlands and hedgerows, but it also thrives in built-up city centres as well. And the dead nettle is an excellent choice for first-time gardeners due to its ease of maintenance. It might sound strange, but nettles make great salad leaves, and if cooked, they are very much like spinach. The leaves can also be used to make a tea, which is a brilliant aid for the digestive system. Nettles are packed with vitamin A and C, and they really are used frequently in traditional herbal remedies. The foxglove is a truly stunning example of a native British wildflower, and it's also one of the tallest, reaching heights of 2 metres that will add real elegance to any garden. The flower is made of one central stalk that has a vast number of tubular blooms on it, and they look a little like large versions of the bluebell flower. The petals vary in colour, with white, pink and purple being the most common. Its leaves are fairly broad, light green in colour, with a crinkled look to them, and they are also coarsely covered in tiny hairs. Foxgloves can be found in woodlands and on heaths all around the country, and they are especially prolific on hills and mountainsides. Be very cautious if you do plant this flower in your garden when small children are about, because the flowers and leaves are poisonous when eaten. But it's not all bad news. The foxglove is used to produce the medicine digitalis, which is a heart drug that is very effective in controlling the heart rate, and although a very old medicine, is as important today as many of the technologically advanced synthetic drugs. Another often overlooked plant is the stitchwort, that is found growing in many woods throughout the British Isles. Until the flower blooms, the stitchwort's foliage goes very much unnoticed on the forest floor, with strap-like green leaves that are very plain and blend into the surroundings. Nothing could be more contrasting, though, when the flowers that the stitchwort produces appear. In many ways, the blooms are a little like an exotic daisy, with a similar petal formation and yellow centre, which is perhaps why it's been given the name Star of the Wood, due to its pointed-shaped petals. Interestingly, the name stitchwort comes from the fact that people used to believe that the flower could cure a sharp pain that can occur in the side of the chest, commonly called a stitch. Our last instantly recognisable wildflower of the British countryside is cow parsley, and throughout spring and summer this plant seems to pop up everywhere. The small white flowers add a subtle colour to roadsides and woods, and it seems to be able to grow anywhere and everywhere, never daunted by pollution, sea spray or even mowing, as it can grow back remarkably quickly after being cut, much to the horror and disbelief of gardeners who have no place for cow parsley. Appropriately, the cow parsley is from the plant family known as umbellifers, but this has nothing to do with gardeners not believing their eyes. It literally means a plant that bears its flowers like an umbrella. Alternatively, you may know this plant as Queen Anne's lace, due to the fact that the flowers look a little like the delicate patterns you get on lace. The plant's connection to Queen Anne, who ruled over Great Britain from 1702 to 1714, is because people thought that when Queen Anne toured the country in May, it looked as though the roads had been decorated with this flower in her honour. Native British flowers, like the delightful specimens we've just been looking at, are extremely good at adapting to varying conditions wherever they grow, and you'll normally be able to see a flower sprouting from every possible location. Even in gardens, people will try for months to get bulbs and delicate varieties to bloom with little success, and then, when they finally give up, in a matter of weeks, native flowers will be pushing happily through the soil in exactly the same spot. Yet with our time rapidly drawing to a close, we'll focus on the two main habitats where you'll find wildflowers, which are namely the natural sites, the length and breadth of Great Britain, where our native species flourish, and the cultivated locations, such as nature reserves and gardens, where even the wildest of flowers are given a helping hand. Nevertheless, although it might sound obvious, while enjoying plants in their natural surroundings, it truly is best to leave them where they are. As tempting as it may be to pick them to take home, the law protects many of our native species, and if we all pick just one wildflower each, even the most prolific plants would very quickly disappear. Wildflower enthusiasts have a fitting saying that if you really want to take something from the countryside, take a picture, and you really can't get better advice than this. But don't think that you need to be deep in the heart of the country to see the native flowers of Great Britain. Scrubland and unused areas, even in cities, are wonderful places to see local flowers, and many towns have green belts that cannot be developed, with areas set aside to grow wild and encourage nature. By simply taking a walk around these locations, we can be face to face with many different species of local plants and learn to appreciate wild nature on our doorsteps. And of course, once you've become interested in native flowers, a good place to see more of them will be at cultivated nature reserves and in open gardens. Organisations spend a great deal of time and money trying to reintroduce native plants and wildlife back into the local ecosystem. The great thing about visiting nature reserves is that they will have lots of information about the different flowers. So if you see something that you like, you can take a note of the name and try to buy it in seed form for your own garden. Nevertheless, if you want to constantly look at and enjoy wildflowers, then growing them for yourself is the best way of all to ensure you can take pleasure in them all year round. And most garden centres will stock everything you need to get started. So, how do you turn a bare patch of land into a lush flowering haven for yourself and the local wildlife? Well, one of the first things to remember is that although this may be a wildflower garden, it will still need to be maintained. Many people are under the impression that simply throwing down a few seeds and giving it a quick sprinkling with water is enough to ensure a beautiful wild patch. Undoubtedly, having a wildflower garden is much easier than many other types of garden to look after, but it still needs dedication and hard work. Even so, this is a small price to pay for a relaxing space that will provide you and your family with years' worth of flowering pleasure. Before you plant anything, plan out your space. Is the whole area intended to be a wildflower garden or just a small section? A little corner dedicated to native plants can really offset the most formal-looking garden. Sometimes it can be really pleasant to have a bench or even a walkway amongst the flowers. Stepping stones and rocks can be picked up very economically from garden centres, and they provide visual points of interest as well as making a good path. If you want to add a water feature, work all this out at the beginning as well. Natural ponds are a brilliant way to bring in more wildlife, but of course, all of these options are up to you and entirely depend on space, budget, and personal taste. Some of the best natural gardens consist of a main flowering bed, a path and some containers for a few of the more ornamental wildflowers such as orchids and foxgloves. Old chimney pots and recycled wooden tubs make really interesting containers, and they can also help towards the natural feel of the garden. When you've planned out what is to remain grass, what is to be planted, and where everything is to go, it's time to purchase your seeds and seedlings. Now make sure you buy plants and seeds that will grow in your soil type. Before you start thinking that this is all getting very technical, don't worry. To work out your kind of soil, simply take a sample to your local garden centre and they will test it for you to see what type it is. They can then advise you on the best varieties of plants to grow in your garden. Try to go for plants that will give a relaxed atmosphere, choosing colours that complement each other, such as yellows and whites and greens and purples. Tall native grasses add height as well as a pleasant noise in the wind. Over time, if you choose, you can also add some larger shrubs and trees that give a variety of interest throughout the year. Before you plant your seeds, remove all the weeds. Remember, that's simply everything you don't want to be there, and rake in a little organic slow-release fertiliser with some topsoil. The best time of year to sow the seeds is just as the cold weather has passed in mid-spring, where the risk of frost is minimal. Simply sow the seeds evenly over the desired space. Don't bother with rows and straggly patches. This can all look very formal, and if you want to create a truly natural wildflower garden, this would defeat the object of the exercise. After you've sown the seeds, rake about 1 centimetre of soil over them so they are barely covered, and finally water them in. After a week, you should begin to see the little seedlings germinating and pushing through the soil towards the light. Remember to keep the soil damp until the plants are at least 6 centimetres tall. In a couple of months, if you keep the little shoots well watered and weed-free, you should find yourself with an abundance of colour and wildlife. Mixed varieties of plants are always good for a garden, as they will have flowers that bloom at different times of the year, so as one type of plant dies back, another variety begins to flower. If you really have no time for this, then another good option is the meadow garden, which can cover a surprisingly large area. Very simply, choose your seeds and then mix 9 parts wild grass seed with 1 part flower seed and sow over your chosen area, and in no time at all there should be a whole meadow of grass and flowers to enjoy. Please remember though, at the end of each flowering season to cut the whole meadow back, as this will encourage the flowers to seed and also stop your meadow looking like an overgrown mess, which your neighbours would perhaps not be so happy about. Like many activities, the more time that you put into your wildflower garden, the more you will get out of it. Great outside spaces are not only about what you spend, it's about thoughtful planting and taking good care of what you have. Another point about native wildflower gardens is that they should be pesticide and chemical free, as the flowers can pretty much look after themselves in terms of nutrients, and the natural bugs and birds that they attract will help to keep garden pests such as aphids and greenfly at bay. One bird will eat up to 1,000 of these insects in a single afternoon, which is far more effective and kinder to the environment than spraying everything with chemicals. If you follow these simple steps, then your garden should be awash with wonderful native plants and flowers by the time summer arrives. Now, sadly, our time enjoying the beautiful flowers of the British Isles really has come to an end. Hopefully you'll have gained an insight into these true treasures of the nation's countryside that are there for us all to enjoy. The species featured in this programme will give you a very good base to start from, and of course, as your interest in flowers grows, there are many more delightful varieties to discover, whether out and about in the wild or in your own backyard. As the great poetic observer of wildlife John Keats once said, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," and in the case of the flowers of the British Isles, never a truer word has been spoken, because once you become aware of these beautiful plants, you'll develop an interest that truly will last you a lifetime.